The hallway didn't just feel messy anymore. It felt hostile. Shoes blocked the path like they had been thrown there on purpose. Trash bags sat outside her door overnight, close enough that she had to step over them just to leave. The smell followed her inside, clung to her clothes, her hair, her child. Then came the noise. A soccer ball slammed into her door, hard enough to make the handle shake. Her son cried inside the apartment, frightened awake. Laughter echoed down the hallway. No one told the boy to stop. When Emily finally spoke up, quietly, carefully, the response wasn't anger. It was mockery. Voices just loud enough to hear. Smirks she could feel without seeing. A clear message: you don't matter here. The building stayed silent, and Emily began to understand the truth. This wasn't about trash or noise, it was about power. Have you ever lived next to neighbors like this? What did you do? Did you stay quiet, or did you fight back? Stay with Emily, because the way she handles it changes everything. Emily Carter lived in the last apartment at the end of the hallway. It wasn't the kind of detail most people paid attention to, but she noticed it every day. Being at the end meant there was no passing through, only stopping. People paused there to leave things behind. Things they didn't want inside their own homes. The hallway itself was narrow and poorly lit, its beige walls dulled by years of careless hands and moving boxes dragged too close. The carpet had once been gray. Now it was a permanent patchwork of darker stains, pressed flat by footsteps that never slowed down. Most of the mess came from the Doyle family. Their shoes were always the first thing anyone saw, pairs scattered carelessly outside their door. Men's boots with thick soles, sneakers in mismatched colors, a child's soccer shoes, still dusted with dried mud. Sometimes the shoes shifted position overnight, kicked aside or nudged by someone trying to pass, but they never disappeared. By morning, there were always more. Next to the shoes came everything else. A folded stroller leaned against the wall, blocking half the walkway. Cardboard boxes stacked unevenly, their labels still visible from online deliveries that never seemed to end. Trash bags were left out overnight, tied loosely, giving off faint but unmistakable smells that grew stronger as the hours passed. Emily stepped around these obstacles every morning with practiced precision. She learned exactly where to place her feet so she wouldn't brush against someone else's belongings. She memorized the spots where the carpet dipped or curled, where a misplaced shoe could catch her heel. When she left for work, she held her son's hand just a little tighter, guiding him carefully through the maze as if this were simply part of life. She never complained, not because it didn't bother her, it did, but because she understood the unspoken rules of shared spaces. People who caused the most disruption were often the least interested in being corrected. And Emily had no desire to draw attention to herself. She lived alone with her child. That fact shaped every decision she made. Noise traveled easily in the building. Voices carried through thin walls. Doors slammed harder than necessary. Emily had learned that staying unnoticed was often the safest choice. She smiled politely when she passed her neighbors. She kept her eyes forward. She waited for the elevator rather than using the stairs, just to avoid brushing past anyone. At night, when the hallway lights flickered and the building settled into its uneven quiet, Emily sometimes listened from inside her apartment. She could hear movement outside, footsteps, laughter, something being dragged across the floor. She told herself it was temporary. Buildings like this were always in transition. People came and went. Messes appeared and disappeared. If she stayed patient long enough, things would settle on their own. That belief helped her sleep. Each morning, she stepped back into the hallway and navigated the same clutter. shoes, boxes, trash. And every time, she chose silence. At first, the hallway was only inconvenient. Then it became intrusive. It started with noise. A soccer ball appeared one afternoon, bouncing hard against the walls, the sound sharp and hollow in the narrow space. It rolled down the hallway, struck a door, rebounded, and hit another. The rhythm was careless and repetitive, like someone testing how loud the building could be. Emily was in the kitchen when the first impact hit her door. The sound was sudden enough to make her flinch. A second thud followed, closer this time, vibrating faintly through the frame. From the bedroom, her son began to cry, startled awake from his nap, confused by a noise he didn't understand. Emily closed her eyes for a moment before moving to calm him. She waited for the noise to stop on its own. It didn't. The ball kept bouncing. Laughter echoed down the hall. A door opened and closed somewhere nearby, but no one corrected the child. No one told him to take it outside. That evening, the smell arrived. Emily noticed it as soon as she stepped out of her apartment. Hot oil, onions, something greasy and overcooked. The odor clung to the air, thick and heavy, following her down the hallway and into the elevator. Halfway down the hall, she saw the source. Linda Doyle had set up a portable electric burner outside her apartment door. A pan sat on top, oil popping and spitting as food sizzled. A plastic cutting board leaned against the wall. Drops of liquid had splashed onto the carpet, leaving dark stains that spread slowly outward. Emily paused. The hallway was a shared space. Everyone knew that. Cooking there wasn't just inconsiderate, it was unsafe. Fire codes were posted clearly at the end of the corridor, though most people stopped noticing them years ago. Emily hesitated, then spoke softly. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't accuse. She only asked if the cooking could be moved inside. Linda didn't look up. The response was dismissive. A shrug, a wave of the hand, a muttered remark that carried just enough edge to make the message clear. Emily stood there for a moment longer than she should have, then nodded once and walked away. That night, water appeared on the floor. Not a spill, exactly. More like something that had been poured out without care. A thin stream ran from the Doyle apartment door across the hallway, soaking into the carpet and leaving behind a faint, sour smell. Emily stepped around it, lifting her son slightly so his shoes wouldn't touch the wet patch. She didn't say anything. She didn't knock. But the next morning, she tried again. She spoke politely, briefly, carefully. The words barely seemed to register. Linda smiled, but it wasn't a friendly expression. It was the kind that lingered a second too long, paired with a tone that made the meaning unmistakable. Emily's concerns were not being heard. They were being dismissed. From that point on, the small things stopped feeling small. The ball hit her door more often. The cooking lasted longer. The water returned, spreading farther each time. Emily found herself listening more closely at night, watching the hallway when she opened her door, adjusting her schedule to avoid crossing paths. She still chose silence. But silence, she was beginning to realize, did not always keep the peace. Sometimes, it only invited more. The breaking point did not arrive with shouting or slammed doors. It arrived quietly, late in the evening, inside the elevator. Emily was returning home with her son after a long day. The building was unusually still, the kind of silence that settled only after most lights were off and televisions had been turned down low. She pressed the call button and waited, her son leaning against her leg, half asleep. When the elevator doors opened, the smell reached her first. It was unmistakable. Old food, damp plastic, something sour and rotting beneath it all. Inside the elevator, a black trash bag sat in the corner, loosely tied, its contents sagging against the metal wall. A dark stain spread slowly beneath it, seeping into the grooves of the floor. Emily stopped short. This wasn't an accident. Someone had placed it there deliberately. She hesitated, weighing her options. Taking the stairs meant walking past the Doyle apartment again, past the hallway where the mess had become routine. The elevator, unpleasant as it was, still felt like the safer choice. She stepped inside, positioning herself carefully so her son wouldn't brush against the bag. The doors began to close. Just before they shut, she saw movement down the hall. The Doyle apartment door was still open. A figure stood just inside. Someone she recognized immediately. A hand reached out, pressed the elevator button for the ground floor, and then withdrew. The door closed. The elevator started its descent. Emily stared at the button panel, her reflection faint in the scratched metal. The realization settled slowly, heavily. Whoever had left the trash knew exactly what they were doing. They hadn't forgotten it. They hadn't planned to come back. They had sent it down. When the elevator reached the ground floor, the doors opened onto an empty lobby. No one waited. No one noticed the smell. Emily stood there for a moment, listening to the hum of the building, feeling something shift inside her. This was not just inconsiderate, it was deliberate. She stepped out, guiding her son away from the trash bag, then turned back toward the hallway camera mounted near the elevator. She knew it likely didn't work. Most of them didn't. Still, she paused, as if the presence of it mattered. On the way back up, she took the stairs. As she reached her floor, she saw the Doyle apartment door closing. The timing was too precise to be coincidence. Emily stopped a few steps away, her heart beating faster than she expected. She spoke. Her voice was calm, controlled. She didn't accuse. She didn't raise it. She simply pointed out the trash in the elevator and asked, politely, that it be taken back and disposed of properly. For a brief second, there was silence. Then came laughter. Not loud, not joyful, just sharp enough to sting. A few words followed, tossed casually over a shoulder as the door shut completely. The message was clear. What Emily had said did not matter. She stood there longer than she should have, staring at the closed door. That was the moment things changed. From that day on, the tension became open. Frank Doyle no longer ignored her when they passed in the hallway. He made a point of muttering under his breath, his voice low but intentional. Sometimes he laughed, sometimes he cursed, but it was always directed at her, always meant to be heard. Linda was worse. She smiled when she saw Emily, the same tight smile that carried no warmth. Her comments were thinly veiled, delivered loudly enough for others to catch fragments as they passed. Emily found herself the subject of conversations she was never meant to join. The hallway grew louder. Doors slammed late at night. Music played just a little too long, just a little too loud. Trash appeared more frequently, left in places that forced people to step around it. The stains on the carpet spread, darkened, layered over one another. Emily reported what she could. She wrote emails. She left messages. She spoke to management when she crossed paths with them in the parking lot. The responses were always the same: polite, apologetic, vague. Notes would be made, warnings would be issued, nothing changed. If anything, the behavior escalated. The soccer ball returned, striking her door with more force than before. Trash bags were left closer to her apartment. The cooking smells lingered longer, heavier, as if daring someone to complain again. Emily adjusted her life around it. She timed her exits. She waited before opening her door. She taught her son to stay close, to be quiet in the hallway, to move quickly. But inside, something had shifted. The silence she had relied on no longer felt protective. It felt like permission. And somewhere down the hallway, behind a door that never stayed quiet for long, the Doyle family had decided that Emily Carter was no longer invisible. She was a target. The rain started early that evening. By the time Emily reached her floor, the hallway lights reflected faintly off the damp carpet, tracking in thin lines where shoes had carried water inside. Her son was tired and overstimulated, his small hands clenched into her jacket as another roll of thunder echoed outside. Inside the apartment, he refused to calm down. Emily moved quickly, her mind split between comforting him and listening to the sounds beyond her door. The hallway was louder than usual. Footsteps, voices, something heavy being dragged. The rain always seemed to make everything worse. When her son began to cry harder, Emily stepped into the hallway for a moment, intending only to grab something she had left outside earlier. She pulled the door open more sharply than she meant to. The sound echoed. It wasn't loud, it wasn't violent, but it was enough. The Doyle apartment door opened almost immediately. Frank Doyle stepped out first, his expression already tense, as if he had been waiting for an excuse. Linda followed close behind, her arms crossed, her eyes sharp and alert. The words came fast. Accusations, complaints, insults layered on top of one another. The door, the noise, the attitude, everything Emily had done, or hadn't done, was suddenly a problem. Emily tried to explain. She kept her voice low, conscious of her son crying behind her. She didn't argue. She didn't insult them back. She only asked for space, for calm. It didn't matter. Frank stepped closer. The hallway felt smaller, the walls pressing in as his presence filled the space between them. Emily took a step back instinctively, her hand reaching for the door behind her. That was when the contact happened. It wasn't a punch. It wasn't a deliberate strike. It was the careless shove of someone who didn't expect resistance or consequence. Emily lost her balance, her shoulder hitting the wall hard enough to knock the breath from her lungs. Her hand scraped against the rough paint, skin burning as she caught herself. Inside the apartment, her son screamed. The sound cut through the hallway, sharp and panicked. Emily pushed herself upright, heart racing, pain spreading along her arm. She stood between Frank and the open doorway without thinking, her body reacting before her mind could catch up. Neighbors' doors began to open, not wide, just enough. Eyes appeared in the cracks. No one stepped forward, no one spoke. Someone called building management. By the time the security officer arrived, the rain had slowed to a steady drizzle. Frank stood with his arms crossed, his expression tight with irritation rather than concern. Linda spoke loudly, her version of events rehearsed and confident. Emily answered when asked. She kept her voice steady. She showed the scrape on her hand, the red mark already darkening on her shoulder. Her son clung to her leg, shaking. Notes were taken. A report was filled out. The officer spoke carefully, neutrally, using words like misunderstanding and shared space. He reminded everyone of building policies. He suggested keeping interactions to a minimum. No one was cited. No one was removed. When it was over, the hallway emptied again. Emily closed her door and locked it, sliding down against it once she was alone. She held her son until his breathing slowed, until his sobs faded into exhaustion. Later that night, after he had fallen asleep, Emily sat at the kitchen table in the dark. The scrape on her hand throbbed. The bruise on her shoulder had already begun to bloom, deep and unmistakable. She stared at it absently, tracing the edge with her fingers. She thought about the report. The officer's tone. The way Frank had smiled when it was clear nothing would happen. She thought about the hallway, the shoes, the trash, the noise. How it had grown slowly, almost invisibly, until it filled every part of her day. Emily had told herself that patience was strength, that staying quiet was safer. But tonight had shown her the truth. Silence hadn't protected her. It had marked her. She looked around her apartment, at the familiar furniture, the walls she had painted herself, the small space she had worked hard to make feel like home. For the first time, it didn't feel secure. It felt temporary. Emily reached for her phone and opened the Notes app. She didn't write anything yet. She just stared at the blank screen, considering possibilities she had refused to think about before. Leaving wasn't failure. Staying, she realized, might be. Outside, the rain finally stopped. The building settled into an uneasy quiet, broken only by distant footsteps and the low hum of traffic below. Emily turned off the light and went to bed. But she didn't sleep. By morning, she knew one thing with absolute certainty. If she stayed, things would only get worse, and she was done waiting for someone else to fix it. Emily didn't leave right away. She needed time to plan, to calculate, to make sure she wasn't trading one problem for another. She searched quietly at night, scrolling through listings after her son had fallen asleep. Smaller places, shorter leases, neighborhoods farther from the city center, where the noise might fade into distance instead of building pressure. Within a week, she found one. It wasn't perfect, but it was clean, quiet, temporary in a way that felt safe. She signed the papers without hesitation. The next step was harder. Her apartment, the one at the end of the hallway, was still under lease. Breaking it would cost more than she could afford. Subletting was the only option. Emily stared at the blank listing form longer than she expected. She typed and erased. Neutral descriptions felt dishonest. Honest descriptions felt dangerous. She didn't want to explain. She didn't want sympathy. She wanted someone who would take the place as it was, without questions. Eventually, something close to humor surfaced. She wrote the ad late at night, the glow of her phone lighting the kitchen table. 50% off rent. Ideal for someone with an intimidating appearance and a short temper. She read it twice, then once more. It wasn't entirely a joke. But it wasn't an invitation either. She posted it and put the phone down, unsure whether to laugh or regret it. The responses came quickly. Most were curious. Some were mocking. A few asked if the ad was real. Others wanted details she had no intention of sharing. Emily skimmed them all, answering none. Then there was one message that stood out, not because of what it said, but because of what it didn't. No questions, no commentary, just a time and a name. Jack Rourke. He arrived exactly when he said he would. Emily heard his footsteps before she saw him. Heavy, measured, unhurried. When she opened the door, he stood a few feet back, hands relaxed at his sides, posture straight without being rigid. He looked older than she had expected. Early 40s, maybe more. His jacket was worn but clean, the kind that had lasted long enough to stop needing explanation. His face was weathered, lines set deep not from age alone, but from repetition, from years of holding the same expression under different conditions. His eyes moved briefly, taking in the doorway, the hallway beyond it, the light overhead. They didn't linger. Emily stepped aside to let him in. Jack walked through the apartment without commentary. He didn't open cabinets. He didn't touch the walls. He checked the windows, testing the locks once, then releasing them. He stood in the living room for a moment, listening to the hum of the building, to the distant sounds of traffic below. Then he moved toward the front door again. He opened it and looked down the hallway. It was cluttered, as always. Shoes pressed against the wall. A box half crushed near the stairwell. The faint smell of something old and unwashed lingered in the air. Jack stood there longer than Emily expected. Not tense, not curious, assessing. He closed the door and turned back to her. "I'll take it." That was all. No negotiation, no follow-up, no questions about the price, the neighbors, or the reason she was leaving so suddenly. Emily nodded. She didn't explain the ad. She didn't warn him. Whatever he saw, or didn't, was his choice. The paperwork was handled quickly. Jack paid the deposit without comment. They set a move-in date for the following week. When he left, the apartment felt unchanged, and yet lighter somehow. Emily packed quietly over the next few days. She avoided the hallway when she could. She kept her door closed. The Doyles were loud, distracted, busy with their own routines. No one noticed her coming and going. On her last night, she stood in the empty living room and listened. The sounds were the same as always. Footsteps, voices. Something dropped in the hall. But for the first time in weeks, none of it felt like it belonged to her. She locked the door behind her and didn't look back. Jack moved in the next morning. Emily was already gone. By the time the sun rose high enough to light the hallway fully, the apartment at the end of the corridor had a new tenant, one who didn't smile at passers-by, didn't hurry his steps, and didn't seem particularly interested in fitting in. He unpacked only what he needed. And outside his door, the hallway remained exactly as it had been. For now. Jack Rourke moved in without announcing himself. No introductions, no awkward small talk in the hallway, no friendly wave to the neighbors as he carried boxes inside. He arrived early in the morning, made 2 trips from a battered pickup, and by noon the apartment at the end of the corridor looked exactly the way it had the day before. Except the air coming from under the door was different, cleaner, colder. He didn't fill the place with furniture. He didn't hang pictures. What he brought in seemed practical. A duffel bag, a tool case, a few plain boxes, a folded chair. By late afternoon, he was gone again. The Doyles didn't notice. To them, the end unit was still Emily Carter's place. A quiet woman who kept her head down, who never invited anyone over, who slipped in and out like she didn't want to be seen. The hallway habits that had grown around her apartment didn't break just because she had left. Habits like that didn't break easily. So the mess continued. Shoes appeared in their usual scattered pattern, a careless spill across the carpet. Frank's heavy boots, Linda's sandals, their son's muddy cleats. Cardboard boxes leaned against the wall. A stroller sat folded at an angle, blocking the path just enough to force people to turn sideways when they passed. And most afternoons, the soccer ball came out. The kid, too old to be doing it, too uncorrected to care, kicked it down the hallway with a sharp slap against the carpet. The sound bounced off the walls, echoed off the ceiling. The ball thumped into doors like it was testing them for weakness. Jack heard all of it. He didn't respond right away. The first evening, the ball rolled close enough to his door to tap the frame. It didn't damage anything. It didn't even leave a mark. But it was an intrusion, an object entering space that didn't belong to it, pushed there by someone who assumed no one would stop it. Jack opened his door for a second. Only a second. The hallway was empty by then. The kid had already run back toward the Doyle apartment, laughter trailing behind him. Jack didn't chase. He didn't call out. He simply looked down the corridor, eyes steady, then closed his door again. The next morning, the hallway looked different. Not cleaner, not fixed. Just arranged. Every shoe that had been left out overnight had been moved. Not hidden, not stolen, not damaged. Simply placed in a straight line along the wall, toe to heel, like a display in a store. The stroller had been folded properly and nudged tight against the Doyle doorframe, out of the walking path. The cardboard boxes were stacked neatly, aligned like someone had used a level. And the soccer ball, bright, scuffed, loud, sat dead center in front of the Doyle apartment door, as if it had been delivered with care. When Frank Doyle stepped out that morning, coffee in one hand, he froze for half a beat. Then he scoffed. He looked down the hallway as if expecting to see someone. Watching. Someone proud of the work. No one was there. Frank snorted and nudged the ball aside with his foot. "Somebody's got too much time," he muttered, not loudly enough to turn it into a scene, but loud enough to feed his own ego. He carried his coffee toward the elevator, shoulders loose, confident in the way people are confident when they've never been truly challenged. Linda noticed the shoes later. She didn't laugh. Linda never laughed the way Frank did. She took it as a personal insult, as if the hallway clutter was a right she'd earned and someone had dared to revoke it. Her voice rose immediately, sharp, irritated, theatrical. She complained to anyone who would listen, then complained louder when no one answered. She pointed down the hall as if the walls themselves were guilty. She slammed her door hard enough to shake the picture frames inside her own apartment. But still, no fear, just anger, because to the Doyles, being corrected wasn't threatening. It was offensive. It meant someone had judged them. Someone had decided they were wrong. And the Doyles didn't do wrong. They did what they wanted, and the world adjusted. So they adjusted back. That afternoon, Frank took a trash bag and dropped it directly in front of the end unit's door. Not in the trash chute, not by the bins, right there, on the carpet. He tied it loosely on purpose, leaving the top slack enough that the smell could escape. A small, petty declaration. "You want order? Here's your order." Linda, for her part, set up her portable electric burner in the hallway again, like she was claiming territory. A pan sizzled. Oil popped. The smell of fried onions and stale grease spread through the corridor, creeping under doors, clinging to the elevator like it belonged there. She cooked slowly, loudly. She let her utensils clatter. Their son kicked the ball harder than usual, sending it ricocheting off doors with a dull, punishing thud. The Doyles were making it clear. "We're still here. We still run this space." Jack didn't respond that day either. He didn't open his door. He didn't step into the hallway. The only sign of his presence was the absence of reaction, and that irritated Frank more than any argument ever could. By evening, Frank was restless. He paced in the hallway, glancing down toward the end unit as if daring it to move. When nothing happened, he grew louder, more dramatic, a performance for an audience that refused to form. The next morning, Frank opened his door and looked down. The trash bag was gone. For one brief, satisfying moment, he thought it meant victory. He thought it meant the person next door had simply cleaned it up, like Emily used to, quietly, grudgingly, without making a fuss. Then he looked down. The bag was not gone. It was back. It sat directly in front of his own door, upright, neat, centered like a gift, tied tighter than before, cleaned off too, as if someone had wiped the outside with a damp cloth. The message was clear without a single word. If it belongs to you, it stays with you. Frank's mouth tightened. He glanced up and down the hallway, heart rate rising not from fear, but from humiliation. Linda came out behind him and saw it. She exploded. Her voice filled the hallway, bouncing off the walls in harsh waves. She threatened. She accused. She listed every rule she believed protected her without ever following any of them. She stomped toward the end unit and pounded on the door, knuckles hard and fast. No one answered. The building remained indifferent. Their son watched from behind Linda's legs, eyes wide with the interest kids have when adults lose control. He didn't look scared. He looked entertained. Frank pulled Linda back, not because he wanted peace, but because he didn't want her to look foolish in front of the neighbors. The neighbors were watching now, through peepholes, through chains, through the narrow cracks of barely opened doors. The same people who had watched Emily get cornered in the hallway were watching again. The same silence, the same avoidance. Only this time, the silence didn't belong to a victim. It belonged to the person at the end of the hall. That afternoon, Linda cooked longer. She turned the hallway into her kitchen on purpose. She boiled water. She fried meat. She dumped greasy liquid into a plastic container and set it on the carpet as if it were a countertop. She talked loudly while she cooked, voice thick with sarcasm, making sure anyone listening could hear she wasn't intimidated. Frank joined in, laughing too hard at his own jokes. They were not afraid. They were angry, and anger in people like them was a shield. That evening, the cooking ended late. Linda left the burner in the hallway while she went inside to take a call. The pan cooled slowly, releasing a smell that sank into the building like smoke. Their son's soccer ball sat nearby, leaning against the wall, still damp from the rain outside. Some point after midnight, the hallway went quiet. Not the usual uneven quiet filled with distant footsteps and elevator sounds. A clean quiet. A quiet that suggested the building itself was holding its breath. By morning, Linda stepped into the hallway and turned toward the burner. She lifted the lid of her pot. For a moment, her mind didn't process what she was seeing. Water rolled at a steady simmer. Steam rose in thin, ghosty strands, and inside the pot, bobbing gently as if it belonged there, was a soccer ball. Their son's soccer ball. Not melted, not shredded, not destroyed, just boiled, wet and steaming. Ridiculous, almost cartoonish in its simplicity. Linda screamed. The sound tore down the hallway like an alarm. Doors opened wider than usual. Someone muttered, "What now?" and then went silent. Frank barreled out of the apartment, face already red with rage, eyes searching for an enemy. When he saw the ball in the pot, his expression shifted. Not to fear, not yet, but to something sharper. Violation. Not of property, of control. He stormed down the hallway and pounded on doors. "Who did this?" he shouted, voice raw. "Who thinks this is funny?" No one answered. He moved faster, louder, knocking again, trying to force a reaction, but the building gave him nothing. His anger bounced off closed doors and came back at him. He marched toward the end unit and slammed his fist against it. Still nothing. No footsteps inside. No voice. No reply. Frank stood there, breathing hard, staring at the door as if he could intimidate it into opening. It didn't. Linda hovered behind him, still swearing, still furious, but her eyes kept flicking toward the neighbors' doors. She hated being watched. She hated being laughed at. She hated not knowing where the punch was coming from. Their son started asking questions. Loud ones. Annoying ones. The kind kids ask when they don't understand the stakes, but can feel the tension. Frank snapped at him to shut up. And then, because anger always needs a place to go, Frank made a decision. That night, he scattered the shoes worse than ever. He didn't just leave them outside, he kicked them outward, across the carpet, into the center of the hallway, blocking the path completely. boots on one side, sneakers on the other. Sandals thrown like they'd been tossed in disgust. A wall of clutter, a statement. "This is my hallway." Linda added to it. Boxes, a trash bag, anything she could justify leaving out. Their son tossed his ball into the mess like a finishing touch. Frank went to bed with the satisfaction of someone who believed the loudest person always won. When morning came, the hallway delivered its reply. Every shoe was still there, but it wasn't scattered anymore. A metal rod, heavy, straight, industrial, had been positioned like a spine, and through it, lined up in unsettling order, the shoes had been pierced and propped upright. Not ruined beyond recognition, but altered in a way that made them look like trophies. Boots, sneakers, sandals, all in a row, standing at attention. It was precise, methodical, quietly humiliating. Frank stepped out, coffee forgotten, and stared. For the first time, he didn't speak right away. It lasted maybe 1 second, 2 at most. A pause so small most people wouldn't even notice. Then he forced a laugh. A harsh, ugly sound, meant to prove he wasn't rattled. He looked down the hallway and shouted, as if volume could drag the unseen person into the light. "I'll find you," he said, voice thick with confidence that didn't quite land the way he wanted it to. "I swear I will." Linda cursed behind him, but her voice wavered. Not with fear, still not fear, but with frustration. With the realization that they were being played, and the game wasn't on their terms. Doors cracked open again. Neighbors watched again. And in the end unit, behind a closed door, Jack remained silent. The Doyles weren't afraid yet. They were provoked, offended, embarrassed. Their pride had been challenged in front of an audience that refused to take sides, and that was unbearable. They didn't retreat. They didn't apologize. They didn't decide to behave. They decided to confront whoever had dared to correct them. By the end of the day, Frank's plan was simple. He would catch the person at the end of the hall. He would make sure the entire building understood who was in charge, and he would do it loudly. Because in the Doyle family, silence wasn't strength. Silence was weakness, and they were determined to crush it. By late afternoon, the hallway had the feeling of a room before a storm. It wasn't loud, not yet. It was the opposite. A tense quiet, threaded with small sounds that seemed sharper than usual. The click of a deadbolt, the soft whir of an air vent, the elevator cable humming somewhere behind the walls. People knew something was coming. They had known the moment the shoes appeared on that metal rod, standing upright like a line of silent witnesses. They had known when Frank Doyle's voice carried down the corridor, swearing, promising, performing for doors that refused to open. In buildings like this, nothing stayed private for long. The walls were too thin, the hallway too narrow. Even when nobody spoke to each other, everyone understood the shape of a conflict by the way footsteps changed, by the way doors opened and closed more carefully. That evening, more doors cracked open than usual. Not wide, not brave, just enough to see. The Doyles were already out in the hall when the elevator arrived on their floor. Frank stood in the center of the corridor like he owned it, shoulders squared, jaw tight, voice climbing with each sentence. Linda hovered near their doorway, arms crossed, eyes sharp with anticipation. Their son lingered behind her, half hidden, watching the adults the way children watch a show they don't fully understand. Frank wanted an audience. He wanted witnesses. He wanted the whole building to absorb one message. Whatever game had been played on him was about to end. A trash bag sat beside his foot, the same kind he'd left in front of the end unit the day before. He nudged it with his boot, then kicked it lightly, letting it slide across the carpet toward Jack's door like a dare. He cursed loudly, throwing his words down the hallway so they would hit the end unit like rocks. He cursed the person who had messed with his family. He cursed the building. He cursed the neighbors for pretending not to see. He cursed the empty hallway itself, as if it were part of the conspiracy. The language wasn't creative. It didn't need to be. The point was volume. The point was dominance. Doors opened a little wider. A woman in slippers stood behind a chain lock. A man in a t-shirt leaned into the crack of his doorway, eyes fixed on the end of the hall. Someone else peered through a peephole so long it left a small shadow on the glass. Nobody stepped out fully. Nobody intervened. The hallway didn't belong to them. Not really. It belonged to whoever was willing to make it uncomfortable. Frank kept talking. He threw insults toward the end unit. He called the unseen neighbor names that were meant to sting. He made promises he couldn't back up, but he didn't know that yet. His voice echoed off the walls, creating the illusion of power, even as the audience watched without respect. Linda added her own commentary from the sidelines. Sharp, sarcastic remarks designed to cut. She laughed at Frank's jokes, loudly and on cue, like applause. Their son shifted his weight behind her, eyes moving between doors, sensing the attention in a way that made him uneasy, even if he didn't understand why. Frank bent down, grabbed the trash bag, and with a dramatic swing, tossed it again. It landed closer to the end unit this time, slumping against the wall. He took a step forward, then another. He was halfway down the corridor when the end door finally moved. The lock clicked, the door opened, and the entire hallway seemed to hold its breath. Jack Rourke stepped out without urgency. He didn't rush. He didn't appear startled. He didn't look left and right as if searching for danger. He stepped into the hallway the way someone steps into a space they've already measured. He wore dark jeans and a plain shirt, sleeves pushed up far enough to show forearms built from work, not exercise. His hair was short, neat in a way that suggested habit. He didn't carry a phone. He didn't carry keys in his hand. He didn't carry anything at all. No weapon, no tool, no prop. Just himself. Frank stopped mid-stride, surprised despite himself. He recovered quickly. He raised his voice and closed the distance, pushing forward like momentum could force Jack to retreat. He stepped close, too close, into the space that most people protected automatically. Frank's face was hot with anger, cheeks flushed, eyes bright with the thrill of confrontation. He shouted directly into Jack's face. Jack didn't move. He didn't flinch. He didn't even change his expression. His gaze stayed steady and empty, not bored, not amused, simply present, like a wall. The hallway felt quieter than it had been all day. Even Linda stopped talking for a moment. The neighbors watching through cracks and chains suddenly looked less curious and more careful, as if their bodies understood what their minds were still catching up to. Frank kept yelling, trying to pull a reaction out of Jack the way he'd pulled reactions out of everyone else in the building. Jack gave him none. Then Jack's eyes drifted down, not in fear, not in submission, but with a calm shift of attention, like someone noticing something misplaced, the trash bag. Jack stepped around Frank without touching him. It was a small movement, quiet and efficient. Frank's anger stalled for a fraction of a second, confused by the fact that Jack was not behaving like a man afraid. Jack bent and picked up the trash bag. He lifted it with one hand as if it weighed nothing. He turned back toward Frank and held it out. Not gently, not aggressively. Simply held it there. Frank hesitated, insulted by the gesture. He started to protest, to spit another insult, to throw the bag back down. Jack placed the bag into Frank's hands. For a split second, Frank clutched it out of reflex. The hallway saw everything. Saw the way Jack didn't raise his voice. Saw the way Frank's performance suddenly looked smaller. And then Jack did the only thing he'd done all week that could not be ignored. He lifted Frank off the ground. Not with spectacle, not with rage, not with the jerky violence of a brawl, with control. Jack's hands found their grip the way someone finds a familiar tool. Frank's feet left the carpet, his body jolting in surprise. The trash bag crinkled in his arms. His curses turned into a shocked gasp. Linda made a sound, half scream, half disbelief. The neighbors froze, eyes wide behind doors. Jack carried Frank down the hallway in 3 calm steps, as if Frank were a piece of furniture that needed to be moved. Frank struggled, but it was uncoordinated, panic disguised as anger. He tried to twist, to kick, to turn his weight into resistance. It didn't matter. Jack reached the elevator and pressed the call button with his elbow. The elevator doors opened with a soft chime. Jack set Frank down inside. Not slammed, not thrown, placed. Frank stumbled, trying to regain dignity, clutching the trash bag against his chest like it was suddenly part of him. He started to speak, to threaten again, to reclaim the scene. Jack didn't let him. Jack reached in, pressed the button for the lobby, ground level. Then he stepped back. The doors closed. The elevator began to descend. And in the hallway, silence took over completely. Nobody cheered. Nobody laughed. Nobody spoke. They didn't need to. Everyone understood exactly what had happened. Frank Doyle had made a habit of treating shared space like a dumpster. He had sent trash down to the lobby so he wouldn't have to deal with it. He had shoved problems away from his own door and into everyone else's path. And now, in front of the same neighbors he'd tried to intimidate for months, he had been handled the same way. Bag in hand, sent down. Not because of a rule. Not because of a report. Because someone had finally decided the hallway was not his. Linda stood still for a long moment, as if her body had forgotten how to move. Her son pressed into her side, eyes fixed on the closed elevator doors, suddenly quieter than anyone had ever seen him. Jack turned and walked back toward his apartment. He didn't look at the audience. He didn't look at Linda. He didn't look at the other doors or the faces behind them. He simply went back inside and closed his door. The lock clicked. The hallway remained still for several seconds after that, like a room waiting for permission to breathe again. One by one, doors closed, chains slid back into place, deadbolts turned. The building returned to its usual quiet, but something in it had shifted, not repaired, reclaimed. Frank returned from the lobby several minutes later. He didn't come back loudly. He didn't storm the hallway. He didn't pound on anyone's door. When the elevator doors opened, he stepped out alone, shoulders stiff, trash bag still in his hand. His face was red, but it wasn't the anger red from before. It was the raw red of humiliation. He didn't meet anyone's eyes. He walked back into his apartment and shut the door. This time, it closed softly. That night, the Doyles didn't cook in the hallway. They didn't scatter shoes. They didn't let their son bounce the soccer ball against doors. They stayed inside, and for the first time since Emily Carter had lived at the end of the corridor, the hallway felt like what it was supposed to be, a passageway, not a battleground. The change was immediate. It wasn't dramatic. It didn't come with apologies or explanations. It came in the form of absence. The next morning, the shoes were gone. The cardboard boxes disappeared. The stroller no longer blocked the walkway. The carpet was still stained, but the fresh mess stopped arriving. Days passed. A week. Frank and Linda moved through the building like people trying to shrink. They spoke less. They avoided the hallway when they could. Linda's sarcasm vanished, replaced by the tight, watchful silence of someone who had finally realized she had misjudged the situation. Their son stopped playing in the corridor entirely. He stayed closer to their door, then closer to the apartment itself, as if the hallway had become a place where the rules were no longer his. No one said a word about what had happened. That was the strange part. The story didn't become hallway gossip. People didn't gather to congratulate Jack or to mock Frank. The building maintained its usual careful distance. But the atmosphere was different. Neighbors nodded to each other more often. Someone held the elevator door once for a stranger. Another resident picked up a piece of trash near the stairwell and carried it to the chute without being asked. Small acts. Small changes. The kind that made a place feel less hostile. A few days later, a moving truck arrived. The Doyles packed quickly, quietly, no arguments spilling into the hall, no loud goodbyes. Frank carried boxes with his jaw clenched, eyes down. Linda directed their son with soft commands that sounded like requests rather than orders. No one offered help. No one needed to. By evening, their apartment was empty. The hallway had space again. And then, almost as quietly as he had arrived, Jack Rourke disappeared too. A neighbor later said they saw him loading his pickup before dawn. 2 trips, 3 at most. No lingering, no farewell. Just a man leaving a place the moment it no longer required him. Emily heard about it weeks later. Not from the building management, not from a report. From a neighbor she bumped into at the grocery store. Someone from the same floor who recognized her and hesitated, as if deciding whether it was safe to speak. They told her what happened in the hallway. They told her about the trash bag. They told her about the elevator ride. They didn't say Jack's name. They didn't know it. To them, he was simply the man who moved into your place. Emily drove back to the building one afternoon under a pale winter sky. She parked across the street and looked up at the windows, feeling strangely detached, as if she were looking at a life that belonged to someone else. When she stepped into the lobby, she noticed it right away. The air smelled cleaner. The elevator didn't carry that sour undertone anymore. When she reached her old floor, the hallway looked wider than she remembered. Not because the walls had moved, but because the clutter was gone. No shoes, no boxes, no trash bags sagging against the wall. Just carpet, stained but clear. Doors closed, quiet. Emily walked to the end of the hall and stood there for a moment, listening. The end unit, her old apartment, was empty now. No footsteps inside, no light under the door. The building felt calm in a way that was unfamiliar, like a bruise finally beginning to fade. She didn't knock. She didn't need to. Emily turned and walked back toward the elevator, her footsteps soft and steady. On the ride down, she found herself thinking about the Doyles. Not with anger. Anger had burned itself out months ago, but with a question she couldn't answer. When people like that moved, did they change? Or did they simply take their habits with them, unpacking them in a new hallway, in a new building, in front of a new set of neighbors who would have to learn the same lessons? Emily imagined them somewhere else, another narrow corridor, another set of beige walls, another carpet waiting to be stained. She imagined Frank testing the limits again, Linda cooking in a shared space like she owned it, their son bouncing a ball off someone else's door. And then she wondered if, in that new place, there would be someone like Jack. Someone who didn't argue, someone who didn't negotiate, someone who restored order without needing permission. The elevator reached the lobby with a quiet chime. Emily stepped out and walked into the daylight, her coat pulled tight against the cold. Behind her, the building stood the way it always had, ordinary, silent, anonymous. But inside, on one particular floor, the hallway had been returned to what it was meant to be, a simple path, a shared space, and, at least for now, a place where quiet could exist without being mistaken for weakness.